If you wish to sample why many of the most famous works on the occult and the so-called esoteric are simply whitewashed vagary and intellectual snobbery without any true depth, stay tuned. Welcome to Biblicultus, where I review books that I find interesting in the topics of religion, philosophy, history, and fiction. Please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, comment on the video, and remember to follow me on X and check out my merch store on the link on the top of the description for the video. Doing all these things really supports the channel, whether it's sharing the video to a friend, or liking it, or subscribing. It really helps me out and allows the channel to further develop if you like it. So thank you very much for that. Now in this episode, I'm going to go over The Reality of Being, The Fourth Way of Gurdjieff, by Jeanne de Salzmann. This particular edition is from Shambhala Publishing from 2011. Now, de Salzmann was one of the most prominent disciples of Gurdjieff, and as such, gathered a pretty active and large following. So I know I'm going to ruffle some feathers here, since I am particularly calling this book a reject review. And for those that don't know, reject book reviews are basically books that I did finish, and I will categorize them as belonging to my rejected books category, and they fall into that category because there was something about them that I didn't like or I didn't find enjoyable for some reason. And in these reviews, I usually will give you a positive and a negative. But for such a famous person in that particular world, I could catch some heat for it, but it is what it is. Certain books I will like, certain books I will not like. I will explain why. You can take from that whatever you wish. Sometimes I may find something to be in my reject shelf that you will like. I mean, in other words, if I give you particular negative reasons why I put it in that category, those reasons might be exactly the reason you like them. That's how life works. And I'm perfectly fine with that and open to it. Now, Gurdjieff himself was a pioneer in the occult form. He was an interesting hybrid of what I would call New Ageism, occultism. And he was very influential. I will put in the notes some biographical information, but he was basically into exploring different religions, exploring paths. But like all New Age, is about doing your own thing, experimenting with different methodologies to achieve God consciousness. So this book is presented as a distillation of her master's philosophy. So she's taking what she learned from him and she's distilling it even further. So I would call it a distillation of a distillation, because Gurdjieff's own philosophy is already an apparent reduction of Buddhist concepts and Vedic concepts and traditional occultism, etc. So by going down and trying to reduce it even further, it becomes somewhat of a boring book in some aspect because it is very watered down. And I've read Gurdjieff's own books, and they're a lot more interesting. They're a lot more mind-opening and challenging. And I actually do enjoy those, even though I disagree with his philosophy. I find them very enjoyable. But this work was not, because of being a distillation of a reduction. Let me go through some positives here, and then I'll say what I don't like in general. But some of the positives. She places a concept called the Watchman, which is the idea of self-observation. So even though it's a clear Buddhist loan, this notion of self-observation and somewhat passive observation of the self, arguing that the real I is nowhere to be found actually, but we only have personality and personality itself is somewhat of a composite, it is still a very interesting approach to it, because usually in Buddhism, there's the idea of abandoning the I conception altogether. Whereas this book, in its confusion, seems to argue that being a watchman of the I is a good idea. And the inability to grasp it is kind of the problem in her philosophical conception. But it is still interesting to kind of mix it up in that fashion. So that's a positive because it makes you think of things in a different way, and I appreciate that. Another positive is the notion that the enemy of consciousness itself is the wandering mind. And I agree with that idea. It kind of fits what I just explained, arguing that to lose focus is to lose oneself. So if you notice there's an hyper attention on personality, how personality is really the core notion that we have of ourselves and of existence. And again, this is a little bit antithetical to the whole breakup of the personality as a composite that doesn't really exist, which is kind of the traditional impersonalist, Mayavad, Brahmavad, Buddhist conception of the self. In that system, the argument is that because personality is a composite of information we gathered as we grew up as a child, our parents, our environment, the people we grew up with, etc., and also our egos, our desires, which is something she discusses, then this becomes really a makeshift reality and is not a core truth. So basically the argument being personalities are really a concoction, a construct, which these days is very popular because modern people love making everything a construct. It's just part of their new religion. But of course, the problem is that if everything is a construct, there's nothing to deconstruct because constructs themselves are illusory, which is kind of the Buddhist argument. That's why I believe that modern solipsism and New Ageism is really a form of Buddhism, but without the philosophical chops to pull it off. Kind of low-tier Buddhism. Another point in the book that I found to be very valuable was the quote that she gave, where she says, "In order to be, we have to play a role." So again, this notion that since we are a construct anyway, we might as well just play the role of the construct. That we have duties and obligations, and then these duties and obligations are crucial. In Sanatana Dharma in India, you will call that Varnashram Dharma. In the West, you would call it tradition. This notion of keeping it always on the issues of duty as a religious obligation. Fulfilling your role in society becomes a spiritual endeavor. And she would call this playing a role and how it's necessary for spiritual development. And I would agree with that. So that focus on work and discipline as being key to being part of a group, an organization, all this is actually a very positive thing. So I appreciate that in her book. And to finalize the positive section of the review, let me read a quote. Now this is written more like a poetic reflection, but I think it's nice. We cannot be without relation. We always obey a relation. Either we are related to something higher, or we are taken by the lower. It is a struggle of forces. There is no before, no after, only life itself. So, very fascinating. Again, ego destruction, but at the same time, practicality. So I appreciate that combination. It's interesting, even though I think at the end of the day, there's a level of incoherence in this notion. Now, going to some of the negatives as I see them, she argues that the science of God can only be approached through schools because people need to work together, and she's basically arguing the case for following a religious system, basically. But then right after, she argues that since everything leads to the same place, which is the classic New Age trope, then schools and religions are really meaningless, or at the very least shouldn't be taken very seriously. So there's a clear contradiction there, because it is basically telling you that you do need a school and a religious system to achieve the ultimate goal, while simultaneously saying that schools are technically irrelevant because they all lead you to the same place. And further on, she even argues that you have to break free from the system. So I know that the argument is you start in a school and then you're liberated from the school. Like you learn how to ride a bike and then you just ride the bike. I get that's the argument, but it is the school and the lessons of riding the bike that continue to guide you anyway. You might believe you're free-forming, but you're not. You're simply following the rules. You're following the system you were taught. And after it, you're just seamlessly following the regulations and the rules. Like someone who doesn't know mathematics, they learn the system, then they do math in their sleep. But that doesn't mean they are not following a system. So this whole system shattering, get free from the system idea, to me is untrue and disingenuous. She also argues that we encounter countless feelings and impressions, and since we can't hone in on them because they're so varied, then we should just go with the act or with the flow, because the facts, reality will somehow overwhelm us. So again, this notion that you live in your own mind and your mind is chaotic and lacks the ability to concentrate or focus, so therefore you should bypass it somehow or flow with it. But again, this is counterintuitive to the reality of facts, which she claims that they do exist. Because if she claimed facts didn't exist, that would be a different story. Now, the book constantly argues about truth, what it is, but then argues that being somehow stubborn, so-called, on an idea or a form is limiting, and we have to let go to see beyond these limitations. But if we do that, then the notion of truth itself is impossible, because there's always a new paradigm to break. So if truth exists, but then at the same time you argue that being stubborn, that being fixed on a concept or an idea is limiting, then you're actually arguing that truth can never be grasped, because the moment you are conscious or settled on a truth, on a form, then at that moment you must break free from it because you're somehow limited by it. Therefore, truth is ever elusive. You'll never even be able to consider it or remain with it for a few seconds. Therefore, truth itself is impossible. And this is the classic problem of relativism and subjectivism, postmodernism, basically. Now, another part here which was interesting was de Salzmann argues that there's a strong need for passion and love, but then argues that these emotions are located in false ego. In other words, that these emotions are based on fears and the wish to be a different self. So you're always kind of trying to emulate an image of a self that's not real. And you externalize it by manifesting passion and love. So you need passion and love, but this passion and love is really predicated on a false ego that is itself not true, but false. And therefore you must go beyond that self. But at the same time, to go beyond the self, you need the passion and love, which is contingent upon having these false egos. Again, that's not only a contradiction, but it's a recipe for self-loathing at the very least. So like I did in the other section, let me read a quote.
"This accord of my centers of energy and their functioning cannot be brought about by forcing. There must be a quieting, a letting go of their movement, in order for a balance of energy to appear between them. But something is missing. I feel I am always too passive, so the need for an energy appears, an attention that will stay free and not become fixed on anything. It is an attention that will contain everything and refuse nothing, that will not take sides or demand anything. It will be without possessiveness, without avidity, but always with a sincerity that comes from the need to remain free in order to know."
So that paragraph is a great example of the intellectual jumbling that you find in a lot of New Age. It's pretending to be one thing, but it's actually saying another. It rejects passiveness, but at the same time advocates for it by arguing that you shouldn't even consider or make judgments in what you observe, which to the human mind is literally impossible. Even the concept of not judging is itself a judgment. It's a discrimination. It's necessary for the brain. So the very idea that you can somehow let go of the very nature of the brain and its job is absurd, and it creates, again, a delusional person, because the person is going around saying, I'm not judging, I'm just observing, I'm just being the self, etc. But in doing this, there is a discrimination, a judgment. The thought itself of saying, I'm not going to judge, is a judgment. And this is why these people are always almost partially schizophrenic. They feel a judgment, they realize they're judging, they don't want to judge, so they say, I'm not going to judge. And then they get defensive because their brain is going to naturally discriminate between one idea and another. Because they chose an idea, I'm not going to judge, or I'm going to remain passive. That's a judgment, that's a discrimination that they had to do. They feel self-aware of it, but they're in denial, arguing that the negative position, the passive position, is somehow a non-judgment, which is not true. And that's why I think that all these systems are highly destructive, because they lack honesty. So again, I do value and appreciate the attempt to forego certain limitations in life and to approach consciousness as a very open source, beautifully expansive conception. This is found in all religions, and I actually appreciate it. But a lot of these modern movements, they seem to have abandoned the original position, which is that when you abandon something, you're acquiring another. Making the claim that you're not part of anything itself makes you part of something, because that is the nature of reality. I think the problem here with this book and books on this genre is a problem of epistemology and a confusion of ontology, the how and the what. None of these suggestions can make sense because of those crooked foundations. If you don't address the foundations, or if you muddy them up, or if you scramble them, you cannot really build anything on top of it. So for someone who's not very aware of these things, they may sound very interesting and fascinating. Yes, anything that is paradigm shifting or paradigm challenging is going to be interesting. But when you dig into them, they always crumble on themselves. So anyway, that would be my personal critique of the book and of the ideas in general. Again, you have the perfect right to have your own opinion on that. And if you want to discuss it, go ahead and put it in the comments, and I'll be more than happy to engage you there. Again, these reviews are very personal. I share them with you, and you can have your own perspective, of course. So please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, comment on the video, follow me on X. I really appreciate all these things. Thank you for being with me. See you next time.